So in my research, I wanted to study the effect that immigrants have on the internationalization process of firms from their home countries. So for example, think of a firm from Japan or from Brazil, and I was interested in a firm like that, for instance, when they are going to invest in a country like the United States, do they pick a location where there's Brazilian or Japanese immigrants? And if they do that, is that actually a good choice for their performance? And assuming that I find those effects, why are they happening? What is it that the immigrants are providing? So to answer those questions, I gathered some data on the investments of firms from 27 countries into the United States during 1998 to 2003, and then I tracked the performance of those investments for several years thereafter. Well, the key takeaways are basically three. The first one is that there is indeed an effect that immigrants have on the location choices of firms, so that if a firm is going to choose a state within the U.S., it was much more likely to choose a state that had more rather than less immigrants from its home country. The second is that if I analyze the survival or how, the longevity of those investments, whether they continued as a going concern, that also the presence of immigrants was a really strong predictor of the likelihood of success. And the third one is that those two effects that I just mentioned are especially strong for firms that have some kind of knowledge-related need. So think of first-time investors in the U.S. who don't know how to do business here. Immigrants seem to be very helpful for those firms. Or a firm that's in a high-tech industry and needs to transfer knowledge from its home country into the U.S. Same thing, immigrants had a strong effect on those types of firms. So it seems to be that the driver here is some kind of knowledge or information that the diaspora network is helping these firms obtain. The biggest surprise was actually the strength of the findings and sort of how robust they were. So if you think about the effect of immigrants, you might think there might be an effect, but it's trivial. But actually, the effect of immigrants on both location choice and the survival was much stronger than the effect of other things that we typically think of as important for firms. So think of government incentives, say a tax incentive or something that the government is trying to do to attract foreign investors, or the presence of other firms from the same industry so that the firm can, say, obtain knowledge when it goes to that foreign location. Those things mattered, but they mattered actually significantly less in the effect of immigrants. So I was surprised by that. I think there's practical implications for several groups here. For instance, if you're a manager, the most obvious implication is that diaspora can be an asset as you go abroad. It can help you pick a good location and perform well in that location. For example, if you are a manager of a high-tech firm and you want to take your technology abroad, you want to do research and development abroad, you may be able to hire someone from the diaspora. Let's say that you're a firm that needs to find a supplier in the foreign location. The diaspora might refer you to a useful supplier, so they might give you information or knowledge that is useful as you go abroad. If you're a policymaker, I think there's also some implications in the sense that we don't typically think of immigrants as sort of being part of the package that firms are looking for when they go abroad. So the question, if you're trying to attract foreign investment, is how friendly is my place to immigrants? Is it a place that's open to letting foreign people come, and that might allow you to bring foreign capital? And of course, it has a huge, I think, implication as well if you're doing immigration policy. We typically don't think of immigrants as affecting foreign capital, and the implication is that they do. Yeah, so there's several examples of firms that have done this, or either by luck or intentionally. So one of the oldest and most well-known is actually the example of Honda, right? Honda decided to come into California in the 1950s to sell motorcycles. And one of the main reasons they decided to do this, and the managers talked about, is just because there was a Japanese diaspora that was there in California and might be able to help connect them to resources. More recently, for instance, there's a firm from Spain called Freixenet. They're in the wine industry. And several years ago, they were approached by a Spanish immigrant living in Australia that made them aware that Australia might actually be a really good place to sell their product because there was sort of a culture of wine growing in that country. And they did actually, and this very immigrant became their first distributor in Australia. And so that's just an example of even coming up with the opportunity, right, because of the diaspora. And to me, one that's very interesting that was part of the motivation for this study is that if I told you that what the fastest growing fast food chain is in the United States, you probably wouldn't know that it's a firm from Guatemala, of all places. It's called Pollo Campero, and it's a competitor to Kentucky Fried Chicken. And they've actually broken records in terms of growth and even sales within a year in a store. And their strategy has been essentially to just follow the Hispanic diaspora in the United States. So they started in California. They've expanded very rapidly. They're in most states now. And when you look at where they locate their operations, it's all in neighborhoods that have a high density of Hispanic immigrants. So these would all be examples of the diaspora somehow helping provide information, support, resources, or functioning as customers and helping firms be successful abroad. Well, I think new strategies for either managers or policymakers are implied by some of what I said in answers to the previous question. But for instance, if I were a manager, I would think, what kind of informational needs do I have? So do I need to hire knowledge workers? Do I need to learn about the foreign location? And I would think, what's the profile of the diaspora in that location? Maybe their education level, maybe the industries in which the diaspora tends to work. So for instance, the Indian diaspora has strong expertise in technology and software especially. So is there something about that expertise that the diaspora has that may help me capitalize on going to a foreign location? And I think for a strategy to attract foreign investment, we might want to think of just how open and friendly our place is to foreigners in general, right? Not just to foreign firms. I think that there are other areas to think about. Perhaps the best way is to flip the question on its head and think to which firms or industries might this not apply. So this study was a multi-industry study. So it seems to generalize to multiple industries. I think, though, that this is less relevant for, think of an industry where scale or just pure capital or size is more important, right? That's not a very knowledge-dependent industry. Perhaps there's not much that the immigrants can provide you, right? I mean, any benefit you'll get will be just from the sheer size and capital or scale of your operation. So I don't think that it would apply to that kind of setting. I think there's a lot of relevant things happening. In some ways, that was what motivated me to do the research, was just looking around and seeing, for instance, the raging debate we have about immigration policy, right? And there's lots of disagreement. I think that this would be relevant to say, look, we're talking about, do immigrants come and consume all our resources? Do they take our jobs? Another question would be, well, can they help us attract foreign capital? And in as much as that's a desirable outcome, I think that that should be part of the immigration debate, even though this wasn't written from a policy standpoint, but I think that there's at least some facts here that are relevant for policymakers. The other thing that we see is there's two phenomena that are really important. One is we see a lot of foreign countries being open, like China and India and Brazil, sort of the BRIC countries, and there's a lot of interest in investing in those. But these are tricky countries to go into, and there's spectacular failures reported in the media. And perhaps the diaspora can be very helpful in tackling those countries. And the reverse is also true. We see multinationals from these countries, we call them the emerging giants, coming out of countries like China and India. And perhaps part of the explanation for their success is these tend to be the countries that have actually sent out large diasporas in the last few decades. It might be a little presumptuous to think that, single-handedly I've dispelled the misperception, but if I had to pick one that I would like to dispel, is that immigrants simply come and consume all resources and don't add anything to an economy. And I think we just haven't thought much about their role in attracting foreign capital. So I would hope that that would be part of the debate. I think there's another misperception, and there's this sense that the world is flat, that information travels freely, right, without any constraints. And if that were true, immigrants shouldn't matter in the investment choices of firms, but yet they do. So social and formal networks seem to play a pretty big role in foreign investment. I think this goes beyond just immigrants. There's other types of formal and informal networks that firms rely on, and these are really important to the internationalization process of firms. And so I think that we can't be naive about this sense that the world is just sort of flat and that personal relationships don't matter. Well, I think that's an important question to explain sort of what does this add. I should say this isn't the first study to establish a correlation or a relationship between immigration and trade or investment. There are some studies at the country level that have established this, and even a few at the firm level. I think what this study adds that is new is a few things. The first one is actually showing how firms strategically respond to immigration, right? There wasn't much of a sense of, would firms actually pick to do this, or is this a spurious correlation? And the sense that this paper gives is that this is actually an intentional choice, and not only that, but it's actually a choice that affects performance in a positive way. And we didn't know, or at least nobody had proved the effect on performance. The other thing that I think it adds is a bit of a sense of why this is happening, right? So this could happen for a lot of different reasons. It could just be, for instance, that places that happen to attract immigrants are also attractive for foreign firms. And this tries to show a little more causally that information and knowledge is why this is happening, that immigrants somehow help firms tap into local knowledge or refer firms to, say, suppliers or buyers, that there's some kind of informational intermediary between the firms and resources in the location. The issue of immigration is an important part of my research agenda. I have a few ongoing projects and several new ones in mind. I guess I'll tell you maybe about 2 or 3 of them. One of them has to do with actually what might be the downsides of a strategy relying on immigrants, right? This study talks about the benefits, and what I looked at as a performance outcome was survival. But if you think about it, immigrants typically represent a really small sliver of the local population, so you might be stuck in a really small niche, right? And you might not be able to grow and target the broader population because the immigrants either have very different tastes or provide you biased information. And so I'm planning a study that looks at actually the trade-off between survival and growth when you go to a place where there's a strong diaspora. Another study actually tries to answer the question of whether, when you establish a foreign subsidiary, is it good to have it managed by a local or by an immigrant? And what are some of the trade-offs? And so that's a study with a colleague of mine, Elena Colcina at Duke University, that we have started. And then there's a third study with a colleague, Seth Carnahan from the University of Michigan. And what we're trying to do is actually look at the reverse phenomenon and think, what's the effect of firms coming into a foreign location and what effect do they have on immigrants? And specifically, we want to ask, does the foreign investment cause immigrants to be more entrepreneurial or less entrepreneurial, right? Because we know that immigrants typically have a high rate of entrepreneurship, but does the foreign investment, say a firm from their home country, does it make them more likely to start a new firm or more likely to maybe go work for that firm and not be an entrepreneur? So we're trying to think of those effects too.